Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the War Report. And we have quite a bit to cover for this episode, so we'll enjoy this next hour and however much change with you. And we shall go on just with some on the ground reporting regarding the situation with the conflict in Ukraine. So, as part of the tentative peace negotiations, there has been a Russian withdrawal from the areas surrounding Kiev, and this is in speculation that forces will be focused on the east. Now, this is taking Zelensky's government at its word, but you had officials of his government coming out and saying that Russia intends to take the entirety of southeastern Ukraine, which, again, make of that what you will, take that claim how you will. But point being is, we are seeing a shift in Russian strategy in this war so far with the lifting of the siege of Kiev. Now, I've heard a lot of different perspectives about this from people both on a more pro-Ukrainian bias and on a more pro-Russian bias. And I have seen, again, no surprise, just with the people I've interacted with, Russians themselves actually. Some of them do fear that this may cause a, let's just say, fortification of the Ukrainian spirit, that it will cause a morale boost for the Ukrainians, seeing as the siege of Kiev is currently being lifted. However, this is, of course, within the same week that Mariupol has also fallen, so while you have that, you also have the gains in the east continuing. You have a lot of people really trying to push this narrative that the Russian military is just this incompetent old beast that doesn't really know what it's doing. Now, again, perhaps you could have expected a faster action from a modern military, but it's also considering that, again, they have pulled punches this war. And one of the big comparisons, actually the two big comparisons I always hear, is Yugoslavia in the 90s, where it was 78 days of sustained bombing, and Iraq, where it was about, I believe, 3 months of
42.
42 days, but like again, like
Before they invaded, but bombing
yes,
continued after.
I think 42 days after the AUMF, but like 3 months prior to that. But of course, it was going on since '91. There were just periodic air campaigns against Iraq from '91 onwards. And I do think there was like a few month one before that. So point being is, it was a 10-year war of attrition before they actually sent in an invasion force for the second Iraq War.
Which
Where
was a half a million,
yes, and
a
yeah,
half a million troops.
yes, between it was like 400,000 of the U.S. and then another 100,000 of all the coalition, whether it be British or any of these various Eastern European countries actually contributed a few hundred troops here and there. Poland was actually the fourth largest contributor after the U.S., UK, and Australia. Fun fact there. A lot of these Eastern European nations did try to buy the loyalty of the U.S. by sending auxiliary troops to the war effort. And we're seeing how that played out now, but I suppose that's just how it goes. Where the Russian invasion was, people did anticipate it, people were scaremongering about it for about 8 years, but beyond some skirmishes in the Donbass, there was no real uh, preparatory action by the Russians insofar as an air campaign was concerned. Now, of course, they had strikes all across the country, but they just sent in boots on the ground. Once again, you can see this as a war of reunification. They intend to take and integrate territory either into a buffer state or into Russia proper, as compared to somewhere like the U.S. war effort in Iraq or Serbia, where it's just, we're going to wreak havoc here. Our goal is to destroy as much as we can, destabilize as much as we can. Where the goal here in this current conflict is something of an annexation or reintegration or setting up of again, a client state, a buffer state, whatever you will call it. So the goals are going to be much different, because the more you destroy on the ground, and again, several people have made this point, we've been making this point since the beginning of the outbreak of the conflict, the more you're going to have to invest in rebuilding once you start hitting civilian infrastructure. So even if you want to assume that the Russian leadership are all amoral, or dare I even say immoral, even if you want to assume the worst, just from a pragmatic perspective, it is in their interest to have a more restrained campaign going forward. And again, I do believe we will find out more about this action regarding the lifting or partial lifting of the siege of Kiev, because that seemed to be one of the crux of their strategy: encircle the city and more or less use that as a bargaining chip. And who knows, maybe they extracted some great concession behind the scenes that will be seen in further days. Again, the fog of war is still very thick, even about a month and some change onwards, about probably 5-6 weeks onwards. We're still have such a limited view of what is actually happening. So, again, we could see in the next few weeks that the withdrawal from Kiev was because of something actually substantial. I doubt the Russians are just giving up on the war effort. It seems like something that is more coordinated, and I would tend to agree with the analysis, funny enough, of officials of the Zelensky government. This is probably an effort to really solidify control of eastern Ukraine, at least everything east of the Dnieper River, and possibly even more, some of what we consider the historical territory of Novorossiya. But that would be my best speculation on the ground for the time being. But there are still many, many unknown factors that we will likely not know for quite some time.
Well, I mean, Ukraine and the Pentagon have been consistent even before the invasion that Russia had not amassed a sufficient amount of troops for a takeover of the country. Ukraine repeatedly rebuffed the official statement of the administration that an invasion was imminent, primarily because there was only 100 some odd thousand troops. And the Pentagon has actually validated many of the things that we've been saying for quite a while, which is at most Russia has allocated about 200,000 troops for this operation. And that's not enough for a real takeover of a country like Ukraine, which has 650,000. That's enough for some small, for some strategic operations that they want. I know a lot of people will cite what Putin said about a week or more before the invasion, when he gave this like long historical context of Ukraine. And that, I argue, is like the metaphysical reasoning from the Russian side about what Ukraine means to them. And there was an article not about a week ago that came out from a Russian, I forget his name. He was cited by Russians with Attitude. And basically he said, what Americans need to understand is that Ukraine for us is our Dixieland. And we will pour anything and everything to take back whatever amount we see fit, at whatever the cost. America does not apologize for its civil war, which cost them more. Even the northern side lost more men in that war than World War II, Vietnam, Korea combined. So that's the Russian perspective on it. The goals at the moment were from the beginning more limited, right? The Pentagon has gone on and said that only 85%, there's more than 85% still available of the total forces that were allocated to the Ukraine theater that could be used that Russia is not using. And I would also say that the strategy basically was to encircle, intimidate the possibility of an invasion. So the Ukrainian forces would have to redirect themselves that outnumbered the Russians 3-1 in all kinds of directions. I think one of the reasons why they wanted to secure for a month now the western flank of Kiev was in case there were forces that were coming toward them from the west, right? From the area of that NATO installation that the Russians took out some weeks back now. I believe it was on March the 9th or so. That isn't to say that tank columns by the Russians were not obliterated in that area. They were. There's plenty of photo evidence, so it's not like all the losses were on the Ukrainian side. But there were well over half a dozen towns that are like 20 to 30 kilometers from Kiev that were taken over, that were still susceptible to flank attacks, primarily because the Russians were told not to disturb the farm fields. This has always been a weakness for a war there, because the possibility of famine has always been there as far as strategic operations in Ukraine and in southern Russia. In any case, yeah, so those forces have been moved, a big portion of them. You're right, there are still forces within 50, 60 kilometers of Kiev, but they've receded on the western side anyways. They've receded further north. On the eastern side, because Kiev is divided into two, the bigger portion being on the western side, but about 1/3 of it is on the eastern side. That side has the Russians encroaching a little bit closer. The forces that have been moved away from the western side, however, are in Kharkov right now, or as the Ukrainians say, Kharkiv. And now the 4th military barracks has been destroyed just today. So this is Saturday that we're recording. I guess people are going to hear it tomorrow on Sunday. And deaths are anywhere from 120 to 200. I think it has taken them a while to figure out where the major barracks are. These barracks, like the others, there was a barracks that was destroyed in Mykolaiv. There was a barracks destroyed in Zhytomyr, which is west of Kiev. And of course, the barracks just outside of Lviv, that was also destroyed. So operationally, the Ukrainians have nothing left right now. They are running out of supplies, and by Russia occupying their time, deciding whether to reinforce Odessa or reinforce Kiev or reinforce Nikolaev or any of these areas, what that did is it gave the Russians time to encircle the pocket of about 60 to 70, some say 80,000 Ukrainian troops on the Donetsk front. These are the most experienced and well dug in. They are certainly up there in terms of capability and experience as the ones in Mariupol. Mariupol alone forced the Russians to commit something between 20 to 30,000 troops in order to encircle it, to make sure that no supplies get in. Now, despite that, there was an attempt to clear out what we presume to be some members of Azov. We don't know. Azov denies it. Azov's current leader has denied it in a recent video that came out just today. But be that as it may, there was an attempt on March 28th of a helicopter trying to go to the Azovatel metal works. This is a factory near the coast of Azov, and it was destroyed. Another 2 helicopters came in, landed, and as they took off, they were shot down as well, ironically with Stinger missiles that had been captured from the Ukrainians, that the Americans had supplied to the Ukrainians. There were 14 to 15 people on board. There are 2 survivors, I believe. I saw one report with 3. The interesting thing is that both survivors claimed that there were 4 or 5 helicopters. Now, I don't know if that's the case. I don't know if they're including that helicopter that was destroyed on the 28th, which was a few days before. It's hard to tell.
And also, just an additional note on that is any preliminary study into eyewitness accounts, especially in times of high stress, show that they can be very unreliable, so take that with a very big grain of salt.
Right. So the Russians, again, have made the same kind of decision that they've been making throughout the war. It hasn't been 100%, but generally it's to cause the least amount of damage. Now, when that isn't working, then they will resort to tougher means. So the Azovstal metalworks factory is now being taken quarter by quarter. They could obliterate it if they wanted to. They could just blow it all up, but they won't. They don't want to do that because, again, Mariupol, it belongs to the district, to the Republic of Donetsk, and it will be very expensive to rebuild something like
Yes,
that.
once again, they
Russia
want to
does not
preserve the actual
have the
infrastructure
means.
because they intend to,
Yeah,
again, integrate it either into, again, Russia proper, which, being part of the Donbass, it would be integrated into Russia proper, or a buffer state. But the point being is, they don't want to spend the money on a reconstruction of this integrated territory because they're not going to destroy everything and go home, or destroy everything, stay a while and go home. And this isn't like an American-led war effort. Once, just to hammer the point home yet again, they view this as their territory, their historic land, and they actually intend to integrate it. Now, whether you disagree or agree with the Russian assertion regarding Ukraine and the historicity of the Ukrainian state or their claims to it, whatever, that's irrelevant to the point that Russia clearly intends to integrate this land. So they want to do as little civilian infrastructure damage as possible.
right, right. And if you look at the photos from Mariupol, it's devastated already. I mean, it's in shambles. This will be very expensive. Um, Mariupol was one of those towns that Azov has been in since 2014, and they've looked at it as a strategic place to hold, primarily because it's so pro-Russian. In the 2010 elections, 90% of Mariupol voted for Yanukovych. And that tells you just about everything. And it was an area that for about 24 days was held by the separatists before they were driven out. Um, they simply didn't have the manpower to hold on to it. Now, so it became, like Kharkov, it became a very strategic place. The same thing with Slavyansk, which is southeast of Kharkov. These are very pro-Russian areas, and for them, they had to secure them, sometimes with an iron fist. This is where a lot of the tortures for the last 8 years have been happening. Like, for instance, the airport in Mariupol, in order to subjugate the population there. And this is where some videos have emerged where at the onset of the war, people trying to flee. If you were, I mean, even if you were going west, you might have been attacked. But if you were trying to flee Mariupol going east, you were going to be shot. And I've seen at least one or two videos.
I mean, the irony about what happened in Mariupol is everything that the Palestinians allegedly do whenever Israel has an operation there actually happens in Mariupol. It actually happens in Lib. It actually happens in all these places that are conspicuously aligned with the empire. So make of that what you will.
Yeah. Right. And the other fascinating thing is that, about 2-3 weeks ago, there were all those photos that circulated about the poor Ukrainian pregnant woman, the young Ukrainian blonde pregnant woman, blah, blah, blah. Well, it turns out she's a resident of Donetsk. And, she was asked by photographers there to pose and so on. So she's very much alive. Now, she did say the hospital was nearly abandoned when the attacks did occur there. But as soon as they thought it was safe to go back in, it was used to treat both civilians and military that were wounded. And then the Ukrainian forces in Mariupol began to shell it because ultimately they're not protecting these people. Like, ultimately they look at these people as orcs and that they shouldn't even be in there. Like, they did expel villages that they hoped Ukrainians from central Ukraine and western Ukraine would go in. I mean, not that that's happened, but they just look at that this territory is rightfully theirs. And so they don't really have a very high regard for the life of the people there.
The very strange mentality of Ukrainian nationalists in terms of how they view their identity, whereas maybe 8 years ago in 2014 it may have been we're the true heirs to the Rus, and now it's almost a complete rejection of that East Slavic identity at this point, especially with the integration of a lot of their symbols. Now, that's not all of them. I'm referring to the Azov types and their affiliates in particular, where it is this ultimate eschewing of this identity that they would have once claimed to uphold. So, again, it is strange, and they are fundamentally more of an occupation force than a native force, so to speak. And just to get in that, you said, of course, there has been the propaganda claims that, these Russians are, Turco-Mongols or orcs or whatever term they have for them. And it really shows that a lot of people will get up in arms about the fact that Russia's stated policy, at least insofar as the war is concerned, that Ukrainians are more or less just Russians in denial. Now, that's, again, a very gross simplification of what their understanding would be, that Ukrainians are just a separated Russian people. And, people like there's a subset of people, you can see this out of the liberal journalist class, who will just decry this sort of rhetoric and talk about how dangerous it is and how it's almost murderous and genocidal. And then, of course, not that I expect consistency or objectivity from these people, but then you have the recent events in Mariupol just over the past week and a half, which I think that goes to show you all you need to know. If you want to take a quote unquote moral stance, if that's your primary concern, then just observe the two sides with your own eyes, and I think you can come to a very easy conclusion on where things stand with that. But that's all I had for on the ground in Ukraine, unless you have a few more details we left out.
The only thing I'll add to what you're saying is that so the major attack now will be in Donbass. Efforts to completely cut off Kharkov have begun. As I said, their barracks has been destroyed. Definitely over 120 dead. Some are saying it's more like 200, which is kind of what happened in Mykolaiv. The West decided to only focus on that NATO base outside of Lviv. But like, as I said, there have been at least 2 other barracks that have been totally destroyed. And maybe the other thing that's very interesting with on the ground in Ukraine is there was a nighttime attack on Belgorod in it's a city just on the border with Ukraine, just directly north of Kharkov. And it appears 2 Soviet-era helicopters went and attacked a oil well, like an oil refining facility, setting it on fire. This happened, I think, about a day or 2 ago. Now, the weird thing about this is the Russians are claiming the Ukrainians did it, and the Ukrainians are claiming they didn't do it at all. And there was even discussion amongst Zelensky's administration that if it was them, it shouldn't have been them, because that's going to ruin negotiations. I personally think the negotiations thing is it's a front. It's completely irrelevant.
It's the token effort to say they tried.
Right, but I'm saying I think that's true for both sides.
Yeah, that's what I was getting at.
Oh, okay. I think Russia now is intent on this completely destroying the Ukrainian military. The reason for that is I think early on they didn't really have a grasp about how many would switch sides or give up. You had kind of conflicting information. You had Kherson, which is in the south, north of Crimea, which like literally surrendered without a fight. There's not even any protest there, and they've begun using the ruble for over 10 days now. Now, there was an attempt by the Ukrainians to retake the city. They got annihilated. So then they said they would try to take it again, but that hasn't materialized. Western efforts to rescue people in Mariupol, well, let's say military assets, have failed. The French and the British particularly were adamant about getting humanitarian corridors to Mariupol, but most of the people in Mariupol are already being taken care of by the Russians by giving them food and shelter and medical attention. What they're interested in, and this is called speculation, is that there are foreign fighters inside Mariupol, and this is why they're so adamant. If people recall, we've discussed on the show before, back in early 2015, the last major front, the last major war up until things got really hot this year, was in a town called Debaltsevo. And this was a town that went back and forth between Ukrainian and rebel forces a few times. And the Ukrainian forces had taken over, but what that had done, because Debaltsevo is situated about halfway between Donetsk and Lugansk, a little closer to Donetsk, and they got encircled, and they'd already had taken heavy losses, but a there was the possibility that they would be destroyed completely on the run, as had happened in I believe in the summer of 2014 in Ilyevosk, which is south of Donetsk. So instead of allowing something like that to happen, Merkel phoned Putin and basically said, "Tell them like not to attack. Give them a corridor out there." They give up the city, Debaltsevo. Debaltsevo is like, I had a friend who worked in Debaltsevo, by the way. It's a huge train yard there. Anyhow, so that was really the groundwork for the Minsk agreements, was that. And Putin took that as a kind of a surrender, and that they were serious. But of course, they were never serious about it. And all this is to say that I mean, if Putin wants to remain in power, if he has to, he cannot agree to like some small agreement of just Donetsk, Lugansk, and Crimean recognition. And it doesn't really look like the Ukrainians are serious about it, which will mean like an annihilation of their forces. There's a very strong possibility that tens of thousands of young men from Ukraine and some from Russia that are going to die for this battle. Ukraine has far fewer people to spare than Russia does, and this on the Ukrainian consciousness will be incredible. I personally don't think Zelensky can surrender. I don't think he would be. I personally think they would kill him if he did. Now, one last thing before we wrap up the on the ground thing is two generals. Zelensky made a broadcast, another green screen broadcast, and he has stripped two Ukrainian generals of their ranks and called them traitors. Now, there was no explanation why this has happened, and there have been plenty of guesses, but my guess is these guys were probably asked to do something that might have been suicidal, and they decided not to. Another possibility, because one of them was stationed in Kherson, and they lost Kherson very quickly, as I said, with like no resistance. And it could be that like they're lashing out, like part of the torture of Russian POWs, and killing them, and then phoning the families of the Russian soldiers who were killed and tortured. Like part of that is to deter them. Even one of Ukraine's, I forget his name. He's a very articulate guy, and he's part of the administration, also with a career in the performing arts, but a lot more intelligent than Zelensky. And he's gone on record saying, yes, employing ISIS tactics is effective for ruining morale. So, but he has also said that the military-industrial complex of Ukraine is finished. And he said this, I believe, Thursday or Wednesday of this past week. Now, that's all the underground wrap-up I have for Ukraine.
And one last story I will add to that is that Ukraine has ceased taking foreign fighters and has disbanded recruitment into its foreign legion. So the r/volunteer from Ukraine threads are going to run out of content very soon. I guess there was just one too many geolocation posts that compromised their security, and they just finally just had to pull the plug on it. But as of that, much like the Spanish Republic in 1938, the international brigades have been withdrawn. And again, just you can make parallels to the American Civil War, but I also think that, funny enough, the Spanish Civil War, especially on the Catalonian front, is also a very apt comparison. Now, some of you may disagree with me on that, but I I do reminisce about that. Not that Putin is any Franco or anything, but I mean, a man can dream, I suppose. But with that being said, getting into once again the economic fallout of the war, we have that Russia, as they have announced a few weeks ago, are only going to sell their energy goods, oil and gas, in either gold or rubles to so-called unfriendly states, which includes virtually the entire European Union. I think probably the only country in Europe that escaped that punishment or that treatment, I suppose I'd say, is Serbia, which shouldn't surprise anyone. Once again, it looks like the Serbs are holding strong and fast to their Russian brothers, which is to be expected. But with that being said, you've already had this come into effect. You've had the Baltic states already have their access to Russian natural gas cut off, and I believe you also had Germany having the cessation of the importation of Russian natural gas being cut off right now. Once again, exasperating the ongoing energy crisis, even though Germany has waffled at times. Statements have come out of Germany from the Chancellor or from the Foreign Minister saying, of course we're going to participate in these sanctions. Then they'll roll back saying, no, this energy is too vital. So they're playing a very wishy-washy game, a very back-and-forth game. One could almost call it an Erdogan routine in that sense, but at this point, the way it stands now, this will probably change by the time this episode actually premieres, so don't get too set on one thing or another. They'll probably go back on it, but as of the time of this recording, Germany is currently going along with the energy sanctions. And once again, this is on top of, I'll just hammer this point home, the shutdown of their domestic nuclear power industry. And one could say this is a deliberate attempt for Western nations to economically cripple themselves to play into the World Economic Forum's plan for the so-called Great Reset as put forth by Klaus Schwab, which I'm not saying I am a true believer in that theory, but I think it holds quite a bit of water. I think people are simultaneously both way too optimistic and way too pessimistic about that, just in the way the WEF actually functions. I'm not saying that they aren't a problem, but I think the way they're a problem is misinterpreted by many, even intelligent people. But once again, getting into that, you have Russia going along with that, and conversely, you also had Slovakia said that it'd be willing to pay for Russian energy in rubles, and Slovakia, once again, being the odd man out in NATO. I remember the poll done back in 2019, in the event of a U.S.-Russia conflict, who should your country side with? It was about a dozen or so European countries, all the main ones. Most of them said that they should remain neutral. Then the second largest survey was we should side with the U.S. Then all the countries had a small minority saying we should side with Russia, except Slovakia, where Russia was in second and the U.S. was in third. So, I don't know. I just find that the whole Slovakia saga, I guess we can call it, very entertaining from that perspective. This pro-NATO Western Slavic, this NATO-aligned Western Slavic country that is still surprisingly pro-Russia, especially when you compare it to the Poles and the Czechs and the attitudes they hold about that. So, I can't make heads or tails of the Slovakian mentality. And maybe it's that big Ruthenian population. Maybe they feel some, kinship with their Eastern Slavic brethren. Maybe that's where the remaining Galician Russophiles are, along with Medvedchuk. I'm surprised Medvedchuk hasn't gone into exile and tried to start some political movement in Slovakia. I mean, at this point he's under house arrest. What harm would it do for him to set up shop in Slovakia? I suppose he'd be under EU jurisdiction, but come on, if he were just up in the Carpathians, I don't think that we would have much problem. But that's, again, I digress with that. But point being is, thus far, only one so-called hostile nation of the Russian Federation has gone along with this. Of course, you had the economic deals where India, as a gesture of goodwill, decided to participate in Russia's rubles for oil plan, and they are, again, establishing a trade with the Russian ruble. And it's not really European Union, and some wouldn't even say it's a country, but it technically is a sovereign state. The Vatican Bank allegedly bought 10 million USD worth of rubles over.
Yeah, they've begun already uh, buying gas in rubles, anyways. But the deal itself is very interesting. Essentially, what Russia has said is create a bank account with Gazprom. Gazprom has its own banks, and open an account, deposit your money. It can be whatever you want. It can be U.S. dollars, can be euros, can be whatever you want, and we'll convert that into rubles. And once it's converted, the pay will proceed. And this is going to basically shore up the ruble,
Yes,
right?
and you can already look at it.
Um,
It's returned back to pre-invasion levels of where it
yeah,
was in comparison to the U.S. dollar. And I think I heard about the Gazprom bank thing before, but it was one of those minor details that really escaped my mind. But you just saying it now makes me think that functionally with that, now of course it wouldn't take over the financial sector. Russia has established something of a state co-opted bank because Gazprom is a state co-opted company, and if it's running its own banks, at that point they do have a state co-opted bank. Now I know that you could argue with some of the central banking systems of the West, blah blah blah, that it technically qualifies for that, but I'm sure you all remember the images from the late 2000s, early 2010s, or up to like 2015 about those images like countries without a Rothschild-controlled bank, and like it would just go through every year, and like sometimes they'd have some crossed off. And I believe Iran and North Korea are the only ones where it stands at now. So, I mean, if you want to go down that line of thought, hasn't Russia established a Rothschild-free bank? Wow.
yeah, it has. The other thing too, about Russia's gas and oil revenues, I think gas. I'll just say this about gas: is its revenues now, off after the first quarter, are more than twice what they were last year, because what has happened because of the sanctions, that this oil and gas are being sold on the spot market for far, far higher prices. So they expect 250 billion as opposed to 121 billion from last year. That's what they're on track for. And the other bit of news on that front is, I believe the Yamal gas pipeline. This is not Nord Stream. It's a pipeline from back from the Soviet era that has been shut down. So um, Russia's been limiting and reducing the amount of gas they've been sending to Europe by small amounts. Um, the last year, so at least a year or two before the invasion. Um, Even when Nord Stream 2 was being discussed, because Merkel asked Putin to build Nord Stream 2, Gazprom and other companies basically told Putin, don't do it. Like, build east, don't build. The West is done, just build for the East. They're much safer partners. They're much more reliable. Their economy is growing. Europe's not so much, not really. Definitely not like the East. And there's no headaches. There's no geopolitical strings attached. And they were right. They should have. Putin should have listened to them. I don't know. Some people argue that's a soft spot for Putin. I'm not so sure it's a soft spot. Maybe I can't get inside his head, but I will say I think he thought that he could make geopolitical hay out of that with regards to Ukraine.
Yes, and you
I
could
think
see
from his
even
point of view,
through the Ukrainian crisis up until I would say the invasion just about 5 weeks ago, that Putin, from the time he assumed office as acting president in '99 up and through again 5 weeks ago, to some degree or another, sometimes more than not, has tried to be conciliatory with the West, has tried to build at least a working relationship with Western nations, and
mhm,
especially early on in his career, he was very pro-Western, wanted to really ingratiate himself to the United States. There were times where Russia was considering joining the European Union and NATO, so it's I do think that maybe he was conciliatory to the West to a fault from that perspective.
to a fault.
Yes. And with that being said, did you hear that Russia is also now a libertarian state? And I
I
don't
did
say
not
that
know.
because they abolished age of consent laws, which they did not. I'll just put that on the record. That's not the reason I'm saying that. I'm saying that because they have effectively tied their ruble to gold. So
That's
Russia
right.
has restored, in some form, I won't say it's entirely, but in some form, they have restored something of a gold standard, which is much more than you could say about really any other nation in the world nowadays. You had this thing where in 2019, I believe it was Italy tried to do something similar where they declared the gold public property, where every Italian citizen was the owner of the gold, trying to restore some sort of backing to at least the euro insofar as they're concerned, but again, more financial independence on that front. So there have been moves like this previously. Of course, that's always been a big talking point in the American and generally Western libertarian movements, has been the restoration of the gold standard, which is something I do carry over from my libertarian days. I do think it's a not a perfect model, but I think it's certainly better than whatever the hell we're working with now. And again, we're just seeing the past, even before the initial breakout of the Maidan and the Ukraine crisis, Russia was buying gold, but especially afterwards, we are seeing the fruits of that. And you could argue that if they continued on with the very financialized economies that, say, most of the rest of the world has, that they would be in utter shambles right now. Now, of course, things have gotten harder. Standard of living has decreased. There has been a decrease in luxury goods. And again, life has become somewhat uncomfortable for people in Russia. But point being is, compared to what it could have been, it worked out well. And I do believe that, not to the same degree, but China has also been another big buyer of gold in that sense, where these up and coming nations are realizing that in order to challenge a globally global hegemony of a financial system, that you need something of real tangible value. And you could see that even with the way the oil and natural gas has been used as a negotiating tool by Russia, that they're using actual physical goods, physical
Hmm.
commodities, again, mainly gold and oil, as backers for their currency, as opposed to, say, fiat, or even the American model, the petrodollar, which isn't exactly backed by oil. It's more backed by, again, it's similar to what Russia is doing, but it's a bit more convoluted because, of course, when you control the global financial system, you can make the rules convoluted as you want for everyone else, and also make them as convoluted as you need to cover it. But I digress on that point as well. But suppose if you have any more to say about the economic standing of Russia at this point, we can certainly go on with that. If not, we can go on to some of the news about sanctions regarding the U.S.
Um, I will say, just as long as we're talking about Asia and India, there were some very interesting developments with Pakistan. Now, America had made threats to both of them that they have to side against Russia or else, and then better stop undermining the US dollar, particularly for India, because from one report, I hear over 80% of oil imports from India are from Russia, and somewhere between 65 to 85% of its military purchases are from Russia. So that's not going to happen. And India is an enormous market. But Pakistan, for instance, Imran Khan made some pretty amazing statements and has continued to do so. Um, he has very much chosen this popular, patriotic, populist stance against America. And this comes on the heels of a report that they published that the US was planning an assassination on him. Now, you know, true, untrue, in the big scheme of things, doesn't matter. This is excellent propaganda, whether it's true or not, and it is cementing support for him. Today on Twitter, even though Pakistan is a Sunni, even to some degree, a Wahhabist nation. He did bring up about uh, Hussein, who's a popular figure amongst like Shia Muslims, and how him and his followers laid down his lives to make a point. All to say that what he's really messaging here is that he's in this fight, and he's, presumably, because he has such strong ties with the Chinese. I'm even going to presume that he's going to even stand strong by India, even much to the chagrin of his political opposers in Pakistan. He even congratulated and said he admired what Modi had decided to do with the American pressure exerted on him to side against Russia. So this whole thing about Russia is isolated. I mean, Russia was always isolated from the West. It was only going to get more isolated from the West. But as far as the rest of the world, that's not the case. And we're talking about a population that's well over half the population of the globe. And I mean, what Russia is doing right now, regardless of what happens in Ukraine, everything right from this point on means we are entering into a bipolar or multipolar world. That's for sure. I think Russia is dead serious. Putin's not bluffing about the gas for rubles, and the State Duma is already saying we want exports in rubles for all kinds of other commodities like food and nickel and potash and fertilizer. Russia has so much stuff, and that's most likely going to pass. So Russia will exert even more pressure, and countries like Bulgaria, they depend 70% on all their gas needs from Russia. Estonia, which is still chilly at this time of the year, it might be Estonia or Latvia. I think it's Estonia. 100% of their gas needs are provided from Russia. So
yes,
we shall see just how strong they are, and even this really isn't Russian blackmail. It's just retaliating. It's retaliating against sanctions and economic coercion that was used against Russia for a very long time. And this is just the first salvo.
While this wouldn't be enough to completely deprive the Russian energy market and save European energy needs, you are seeing discussions of that pipeline proposal back in 2019 that was a collaborative project between Israel, Egypt, Cyprus, Greece, and Italy. And I believe even the Palestinian Authority was also in on it, just show with that, to get that gas that was in the Eastern Mediterranean into Europe. So you have seen revived talks of that. That was in talks under the Trump administration. When Biden came in, he said it was a no-go. Now there is talks that he may be more sympathetic to that. So it could be interesting because, well, with what you had there is, at least under the Trump foreign policy, they had intention to sell American energy to Europe, whereas Biden just cut it off and said, hey, you're on your own. Where even though it isn't of direct benefit to Russia, even though I do believe they actually had proposals for investment and assistance in building because of their expertise in constructing pipelines over the past several years, it would be another step towards multipolarity to have another non-American energy source flowing into Europe with that. So we could see that as well, which could also be a game changer again. It certainly isn't enough to fuel the entirety of Europe, and once again, it also wouldn't be enough to cripple Russia, because despite all of this, oil and gas still make up, as of the most recent figures, I suppose we'll see what it looks like after the 2022 data comes out, makes up roughly 6% of the Russian export economy is in energy resources. But with that being said, speaking of sanctions, the U.S. has issued waivers for sanctions on fertilizer products from Russia in order to prevent a food shortage. Now, you'll recall at Biden's press conference the other day, he was saying that Americans should be concerned that there may be something of a food shortage, the markets may not be as abundant as they once were, and now we see the waiver of those sanctions at this time, with that playing out, which I find humorous that once again, after years of this so-called strong united front against Russia, even the heart of the empire itself is waiving sanctions. Now, we haven't done that for energy needs yet. We also haven't rebooted our own domestic energy production yet, so gas prices are going to remain high and going to remain as high as they were. But also, speaking of Biden press conferences, he was caught having a little cheat sheet with him, and that entailed several scripted questions with scripted answers that he was supposed to give. And I can get the exact quotes on that from the screenshot that was gotten, and taking a look, it's one of the funnier things I've seen out of the Biden administration with that. And it was regarding this press conference and the discussion of NATO, Ukraine. So it is entitled, bold, underlined, tough Putin Q&A talking points. So the first question is, if you weren't advocating for regime change, then what did you mean? Can you clarify? And this is in reference to when Biden said, there's no way Putin can stay. And the two scripted answers are, I was expressing the moral outrage I felt towards the actions of this man. And the other one is, I was not articulating a policy change. And the other one is, Macron said that he would have used the UK government suggested. Macron would have said, and it's a bit cut off, he would have used these UK government suggested it was a problem. Is this now threatening to splinter unity within your NATO allies? And the talking point is, here is just the best written answer you've ever heard. Complete linguistic kill shot. No, NATO has never been more united.
They always feel like they have to mention that. I think we understand. NATO has never been more united. America has never been more united.
Yeah.
You think America was united after World War II? You ain't. Check out 2020 to 2022. Very united.
Yeah. And I love that point, because you also have Macron, who just a few years back was calling NATO a brain-dead entity. The fact that even now. And again, a lot of Macron's moves, as I predicted, were something you could have attributed to the Trump administration, which is why he took more independent action. He's more or less fallen in line as Biden has assumed office, but they even still feel the need to take pot shots at him for his transgressions 3.5, 4 years ago at this point. And I do think that's not necessarily because of him, but they fear what a French leadership that would actually be interested in a more independent direction could do. And I am really curious for of course, the infamous maps I always reference. Let me see. Okay, so I have the EU Biden map. And, of course, most of the countries are dark blue, which the projection was they will increase ties with the U.S. The pink countries would say they were going to seek other ties outside of the U.S., and the light blue countries would be they were going to maintain current ties with the U.S. I am very curious to see what this map would look like now. And I imagine all of their stated policy would be dark blue, whereas if we're talking realistically, it would probably be the light pink, purple, magenta color. So, once again, they just have to hammer home this point that most unified NATO or the U.S. or whatever has ever been, because it's... Look, I don't usually like accusations of projection, but if there ever was a case...
Yes. You know what? One thing we should mention is there are two major elections tomorrow, and that is Hungary and Serbia. And I think, we're definitely going to see a re-election of Vučić and Orban, and they're working more and more closely together. Hungary and Serbia are working on all kinds of joint projects now. It's a really, really interesting development. Of course, there's the French elections, because we were talking about Macron, from the 10th to the 24th, and then I think there's a legislative election in June from the 12th to the 19th. There's an election on the 24th of April in Slovenia. And in September, there's an election in Austria, as well as an election in September in Sweden, and then another
And
one in Latvia.
yeah, of
So
course, the
there's
big
so
elephant in
much
the
going
room
on.
is the French elections, which will be in the next couple weeks here.
Yes.
First round, at least. Then, if it goes to a second round, which I don't think it will. I think Macron is probably going to win pretty handily
Yeah, I do
in the
too.
first round. But if not, a second round will be in May, and it looks like his main opposition is some mix between Zemmour or Le Pen, which, of course, if it's either of those two, they can really hammer home. I mean, you had Le Pen, of all people, saying back in 2018 that the Western countries should recognize Crimea as Russian territory, so Macron has this election pretty handily secured. But again, it's a year
Yeah.
of elections, as you were saying. I concur that both Orban and Vucic will come out on top, and they will continue on with what they've been doing. And again, Hungary continues to balance on that tightrope, continues to walk down that middle line, and more or less opening a door with Serbia. And you could say, and I'm sure you all saw the story about the flights that were going from Western countries to Serbia to Russia as a circumvention of sanctions. And I think it's reasonable to say that Hungary also probably intends to use the Serbian market as a circumvention of Russian sanctions. And I do believe that Serbia will
Absolutely.
find a lot of new economic activity in, let's just say, less loyal European nations in order to facilitate economic relations with Russia, that Serbia will become a big go-between. And for all we know, I wouldn't be surprised if they start some sort of media campaign against Serbia for that reason, try to say that they're plotting, again, that they're violating long-standing agreements regarding Kosovo, or they're being aggressive towards Montenegro, or just the usual claptrap they pull out whenever they want to do this,
Yeah, yeah.
in order to put more heat on them, in order to, again, by proxy, put more heat on Russia, because I do think that going forward, over the next few months especially, and probably for the foreseeable future, that Serbia is going to be a very important go-between for Europe and Russia.
That's a really good point. Yeah, so who knows? Maybe because the deals I'm talking about, that process has already started in like over a year ago. So maybe they were anticipating something.
Yes.
Maybe they were in
But
the
even with
loop.
the
Who
previous
knows?
standing sanctions, it could have been regarding those as well.
Yeah, yeah. So I think the other thing to mention, especially with Serbia, is there's a pretty strong liberal component that has been dying to get into the EU and at any cost. Some people are saying that they're going to try right after the election some kind of color revolution to happen there. But personally, like my buddy just came back from Serbia, and the atmosphere there is phenomenal. The support for Russia is overwhelming. It has destroyed any possibility of opposition parties from beating Vucic whatsoever, and it's the same kind of thing happening in Hungary. Maybe
Even in
Orban will
Bulgaria,
win.
you had a pro-Russia rally along the same lines as the one in Serbia. So again, you have these so-called, I guess you could say, distant nations, where Hungary, especially Serbia, obviously, and even getting into a country like Bulgaria, and it's interesting developments in that southeastern corner of Europe that includes the Balkans, but not entirely the Balkans.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that Spengler always said in his essays on Russia was that there are like three primary directions that Russia goes to, right? There is always a Peter the Great impulse towards Europe, to being kind of like a junior partner to Europe, learning from Europe, in the same way that the Germanic tribes after the fall of the Western Roman Empire looked upon Rome, right? And the other two impulses, well, you could group them as one, is to go south and east. And Spengler always considered that this other impulse is the more authentic impulse, that St. Petersburg itself is kind of like a false city. It's a city designed to look to Europe, but it does not address like the actual uniqueness of the Russian soul. and it only prolongs its kind of junior-like status, right? Now, the difficult thing, of course, is that, Western Russia looks very much like Europe, at least the people do, and the customs are more closely aligned, and there's just more commonality, and this is why there's always this East-West tension. But I think from now on, the effect will be South and East. That's where the push will be. And this is going to be overall, it's going to be a good period. Because if you look at, one of the horrible things about Russian history is it's the first civilization that has had to start in the modern era. Every other civilization did not have to go through that. And the modern era has all kinds of deleterious effects upon society. Right now, we don't know. It could be that you can separate the mechanisms of say, liberalism and the Industrial Revolution, right? Maybe that's possible. I think that's actually what China and Russia are trying to do.
Yes, I think you've seen previous attempts throughout the fascist and communist movements of the 20th century, I would say, was the first real push to divorce that. Those both failed for various reasons we're not going to get into right now. And you have both China and Russia addressing those. For example, I believe it was Chinese state economists at the direction of Xi Jinping are now beginning to study economists like Friedrich List, and moving away from the more, say, traditional Marxist-Leninist idea that modern China was built upon. That, again, it's evolving into that. You also had the readings of Carl Schmitt also influencing Chinese policymakers as well in the recent years. I imagined also much the same in Russia. So it is really, I suppose you could say, it comes down to both liberalism and illiberalism. And you could even argue somewhere like Hungary and is a microcosm of that with their idea of what they, in fact, build themselves as illiberal democracy. This idea of trying to divorce the social rot of the modern world, but keep the technological progress. And it's probably one of the most ambitious experiments in human history. And I think it's far too soon to say the results of it. I think it's far too nascent to make a diagnosis, even though I do believe it's theoretically possible, whereas a lot of people would say that it's simply impossible.
Yeah, well, Mike from Imperium Press and Joel Davies have had conversations about this, because the flip side of this is, can you divorce the Industrial Revolution from the West and its liberal ideologies? That too has to be done, and it's probably going to be easier to do because the self-identification with it is much stronger in the West than it is in Russia or China. Even the self-identification is even weaker there. That liberalism need be attached to the Industrial Revolution or the Fourth Industrial Revolution or whatever you want to call it.
And I do think it's also worth noting that the Industrial Revolution in Western Europe and the Anglosphere took a much different form than the Industrial Revolution in Russia and especially in China. Now,
right, because the Industrial Revolution in Russia, essentially what it did is it killed art forms that were developing. So the Russian novel, in a sense, died after the Communist Revolution. Pasternak is not really that important to Russians anymore. And history has shown that, Dostoevsky embodies Russia far more than even Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky embodies Russia even more so than Tolstoy, who has much more Western ideas. He's more like comparing St. Petersburg to Moscow. And this isolation from Europe sets the possibility to have different artists achieve greater things, kind of like Tarkovsky. Tarkovsky is Russia's most celebrated and best film director, and he did eventually leave Russia, but he made some of his films while in Russia and away from Russia, but kind of like various Russian novelists, like Nabokov, they continued that tradition outside of Russia, right? So what I'm saying is this closing off from the West allows them to develop new art forms, because there are no great artists in Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union. They don't exist.
Well, I dare you to
There's
find
a
a great
there's a
artist
there's a
anywhere in the past half century.
Now, a phenomenal film is The Russian Ark, but that's very few and far between. There is too much Western influence, and they don't stack up to anything by Tarkovsky, is what I'm saying.
Yes, and I would agree with you that the cultural divorce is probably one of the most significant things for these nations. In fact, something I had advocated for I think it was 2019, I said that truly populist and nationalist nations need to focus on prioritizing especially their own language media over English language media if they want to preserve any sort of cultural unity. That the English language, I'm not saying they should ban it outright, but the English language is a corrosive force in non-English speaking countries and must be understood as that way.
Yeah, it's the only, like, even nowadays, why do Chinese diplomats wear Western suits? It's because the West has won so pervasively throughout the world that everybody has to play the game. Or when people talk about joining various institutions, I mean, almost like every institution that they talk about was created either in the interwar period, but the vast majority were created after World War II. And there's no way to advance unless you play their game. And to a great degree, Putin kind of navigated that sphere, played their game as much as they could, and when the time was ripe, left that game, left that institution, so on and so on and so on. And you see China almost willing to do the same thing, although they in some sense have bought out some of these institutions. So there is going to be probably a reckoning day with China coming up, probably in 2025 after the 2024 election. I don't even know if Biden can make it till 2024. A lot of people speculate he won't.
And you even had behind the
we shall
doors
see.
discussion with the Canadian government speculating that Kamala would be in power after the midterms this year. And if anyone were to have prior knowledge of something like that out of any foreign leadership, if not Israel, and you could even argue that we wouldn't give that information to Israel, it would be Canada, because they are assuredly they're a vassal in the most literal definition, that they have no recourse against the U.S., even compared to other very docile allies, even compared to somewhere that's been under American occupation for 80 years like Germany. But that's aside the point. And with that being said, the last story I have is some news out of the Middle East, particularly out of Iraq, where a few weeks back you had that missile strike on U.S. consulates and the U.S. Embassy. From the missiles originating, I believe, from East Azerbaijan in Iran. And now you have Iranian-backed forces in Iraq storming into Kurdish areas and taking the fight to them. And that is probably the biggest disturbance of the post-Iraq war order established from 2006 onwards, where the Kurds have had I guess you could say, de facto independence since around that 2006 area, where they've had a lot of self-governance over the area, and even to the point of raising their own armed forces, as we saw with the war against ISIS. And for the first time since then, you have seen the Iranian-backed forces storming into their territory, storming into some of their government buildings, their military facilities, and really putting an end to the Kurdish problem, which is the definitive American-Israeli proxy force there. As you recall, after the invasion of Iraq, oil that originated from the Kurdish-controlled areas was being shipped to Israel. So, with that being said, it does look like they're taking this primary time to strike at what is really this, you could say, seat of American influence on their border, and Iran has continued these actions, and of course it's all in the backdrop of trying to salvage whatever's left of the JCPOA into a working nuclear agreement. And with that being said, again, I think understandably so, because of the conflict in Ukraine, that Iran's actions have been vastly overlooked by a lot of people, that what's actually happening in the Middle East with Iran in particular is monumental, and that's not even to mention what's been happening with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states and Syria. And again, I just thought it was worth mentioning, at least for the time being, just to bring everything together and acknowledge that this is a direct result of what is happening right now, and we are seeing the collapse of the current world order, or should I say the new world order, which Biden also used that term in his speech, in real time. And he was talking, of course, how we need a new world order because apparently George H.W. Bush's new world order from 1991 wasn't enough. So it looks like these things have a shelf life of about 30 years or so. So I can't wait to see you guys in the 2050s when we have who the hell will President trans black woman in 2050 telling us about how we need a new world order. Assuming the American empire gets that far, which I think these pivotal years will be the determining factor, especially seeing how Russia not only copes with the war itself, but the fallout from the war. And you could argue that they're actually scoring more victories outside of Ukraine than inside Ukraine. Not to play into the propaganda that Russia is an incompetent fighting force, but I would argue that many of Russia's victories thus far have come from actually outside the battlefield on the global stage than actually inside the battlefield.
Right, right, and and to that, I would also add that I think what Russia is also, because they went in with such a small force, I have to conclude after 5 weeks that what they want is a kind of capitulation from other regions within Ukraine that are going to play ball. In other words, there was never, I don't know, on our show, I never believed that Russia was actually going to storm and take over Kiev, or was even going to try, because they would literally need not 200,000, but more like 500,000 troops in Ukraine to achieve that. And you can see that as time has progressed, they have ratcheted up the damage inflicted on the Ukrainians. They didn't do anything the first 2 weeks, taking out, or the first 3 weeks for that matter, taking out any oil supplies, but now they are. Especially the last week, they have taken out important strategic targets that limit the mobility of the Ukrainians, and they are creating these cauldrons for some time. I mean, even in the medieval era, Russia has used this cauldron type approach. And so I think what they want is a kind of a capitulation from the bigger centers to go along with this. And we can only speculate when that will be. But again, as you say, the bigger victories have happened in the economic and in the diplomatic fields. Like, let's say, just to return to the gas deal, the way things would have happened before in the past is the EU would have, because the EU, except for oil, which they use American dollars for, they did use the EU dollar to buy gas from Russia. And so what would happen is that money will be deposited into Russian banks, even Gazprom Bank. And then a portion of that will be converted into rubles. Another portion would be converted into yen or yuan or US dollars. And that would go into offshore, like treasuries, and it would go into offshore, like banks outside of Russia, Russian banks outside of Russia, right? To just add more flexibility to the economy.
The Cyprus tax haven.
Yeah, I mean, I'm saying it's even more simple than
that. I know it's the obligatory.
Like they would go. Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah, that's another one. But let's say Switzerland and Germany and France and so on, right? And Britain. So essentially, that is not going to happen at all. There will be no further investment whatsoever So they will not buy any more EU dollars and store them as EU dollars the way they had done. And so this changes everything, right? Like if Europe really, really wants to go hard, you know, they're going to wreck themselves. And with America, I think they're okay with that because it's not going to affect America as badly. Now, that said, I saw a report that America bought yet more oil from Russia, which I thought they had an embargo on. I thought they weren't doing that. So, do as I say, not as I do. But I mean, Europe is a junior American partner, so
Yes, and I will say with
do
that
their
oil
best.
point is I'm still predicting a new golden age of piracy on the high seas over the next few years. I mean, because
Yeah,
with the as we discussed this in a previous episode, with the dynamics of the American Navy's control of global sea lanes, at some point, seeing as no country really has a Navy force that could challenge at least the U.S. in that aspect, sure, maybe in the Baltic Sea or the South China Sea, Russia and China respectively could hold their own, in fact, even win, but you don't exactly see China or Russia poised to be a great naval power able to defend its own shipping and interests. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see the return of the privateer in some way, shape, or form
yeah,
on the high seas, because at this point, especially if the American Empire is going to be much more heavy-handed with its imperial power, as I believe we're seeing right now, it's going to be an inevitability even among so-called allies. Even I wouldn't be surprised if even some European countries started to participate in this. I do think we got a precursor to this. I think we got a taste of this with the oil tanker crisis in the summer of 2019, with the shipping of Iranian oil and the seizure of vessels, and of course Iran attacking Saudi or Emirati vessels. So we've already seen how this can happen in the modern world, and I do believe we're in for much more of that on a much grander scale in the near future. And that is all I had for today. If you have anything else, I suppose now would be the time. If not, I'm going to go ahead and bring us to a close. But with that being said, thank you everyone for tuning into this episode of the War Report. We will see you guys next time, and goodbye.